Luke Thomas is one of the world's top combat sports personalities, the host of both Morning Kombat and the Luke Thomas YouTube channel. Luke joins us to tell his origin story, how he got into combat sports, the evolution of the media landscape, his foray into YouTube, what it's like working with Brian Campbell on Morning Kombat, and the secret to how he's been able to amass over 100 million views and 350,000 subscribers across two channels. Join us for this exclusive Advertising Week creator interview with Luke Thomas.
All right, we are joined by Luke Thomas, the host of Morning Kombat. Luke, thank you so much for joining us for an Advertising Week interview.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So typically we like to start these and learn a little bit about you before maybe everybody that watches your channel and your work today and follows your coverage in combat sports. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing, where you're from, the early days of Luke Thomas.
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny. Things come full circle. I currently reside in Washington, D.C. I've lived in Washington, D.C. most of my life, which is strange if you know anyone from the area. It's typically pretty transient. There's a lot of people who live here for a brief time and then they go. I grew up here as a kid. I went to Peabody Elementary, for anyone from the area who might know where that is, and then stayed in the area for a little while. My parents split up, spent a little time in Northern Virginia, then ended up in Georgia. I attended the College of William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, and I joined the Marine Corps right out of high school. So I did the Marine Corps doesn't have ROTC. You could either just join it or you don't. And I didn't want to be an officer because I didn't want to do it for a career, but I wanted to join. So I actually did the reserves through college and then 2 more years thereafter. And moved around a little bit of the country, but basically was back in DC by the time I was 24 years old. And I've been here ever since. And the way I kind of got started, I'm a combat sports analyst for CBS Sports. And the long story short about how I got into that was I moved here for a job, but I didn't really know anybody, even though I had moved back to the area. But I was a kid. Like everyone who I grew up with was long gone, for the most part anyway. And I had just seen an advertisement on TV for a gym nearby that was doing MMA, mixed martial arts. And I had done a little bit of something similar in the Marine Corps. I had followed it as a kid when I was 14, actually during one of my summers when I lived with my father here back in DC. So I went, and ever since I've just kind of been hooked on it. And I got into the media side when I naively thought that I could just sort of check up on the results of my teammates who were competing, and then there was nothing. And I was like, well, that seems quite strange. And then one thing led to another, and here we are.
And so this was like early 2000s when you started exploring the media side of combat sports?
Yeah, I mean, when I was 14, so I never caught UFC 1 when it actually happened, but I'll never forget, I think it was a summer of 1994, and I would live with my mom I would go to school and live with my mom for most of the year, and then I would spend my summers back in DC with my dad. And my dad had a family friend who owned his own martial arts school, and I remember this very vividly. He came over one day and was like, you got to see this. We have to go. This is how old I am. We have to go to Blockbuster. We have to go to Blockbuster Video, and we have to rent this video. There's this skinny Brazilian guy who's beating everybody up, and it ended up being Royce Gracie. And I kind of kept up with it, did a little bit of judo through college, just having fun, nothing quite serious. And then I always kind of wanted to finish that journey a little bit and do a little bit more. And again, I did a little bit with the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, but these are very basic things. And then there was a gym that was like a mile from the house where I was staying at the time. And so I just went, and I wanted to just train. I didn't really actually have any ambitions to get on the media side. I was working in, basically, I was like you can call me a speechwriter, a messaging consultant, sort of PR, like doing messaging for various either political or private clients. And I hated it. I really hated it. And then I realized like there was this whole universe that, I mean, it wasn't like I joined MMA Media. MMA Media didn't exist when I first wanted to get going. But I thought like maybe there's something there. So far that's been true.
Yeah. And so what were those early days? Like, how were you supporting yourself? Because it was so early as far as combat sports. I don't imagine there was a huge economy, not only for fighters, right, but for journalists and media. So did you have jobs on the side as you were like doing this as a passion project?
So I had a full-time job. I was doing either PR or
Okay, that was the
you know,
full-time job. I see.
Yeah. I mean, DC's full of people. Again, I wasn't quite PR. There was some PR elements to it. It was a lot of work on messaging for either private or political clients. It would really depend on the job, but I hated it. It really made me, listen, there's two different kinds of Washington DCs, right? Like there's the people who live here for long stretches of their life, and that's what I consider myself. And these are very down to earth, awesome people, and I wouldn't want to live really anywhere else. But then there's the other side, which are the people who are transient, and these are people who have political ambitions, and these are people that, the only time people in this town need messaging help is when they're doing something terrible to the world, right? I mean, who else needs the help? Like, you just think about it realistically, right? So I really hated that job. So then at first I worked at SB Nation before it was ever Vox Media. It was just SB Nation. The guy there recruited me by the name of Nate Wilcox to run bloodyelbow.com. I had just been fooling around on, either various forums or various blogging sites or whatever at the time. I don't even remember fully how he found me, but he asked me to take this over. They were trying to put something together. So I did. That ended up being bloodyelbow.com. And what ended up happening during that time was that I just got into it just because I'm bored or needed something to do or it interested me. And then what ended up happening was The Ultimate Fighter was this television show which had aired in 2005, and that definitely, there was a bit of a boom after that, but the boom kept going. And I actually didn't go full time until 2011. Right around 2008 or 9, this guy who came from pro wrestling, and then he was a NCAA or I should say national champion at the University of Minnesota, Brock Lesnar, came through. And I'll never forget the night he made his UFC debut. I looked at the traffic on Bloody Elbow, and it was extraordinary. And I said to myself, I think I can make a living from this. If I can get numbers like this, I can do something with this. And sure enough, Bloody Elbow, not just because of what I was doing, it was a whole team. And again, Nate Wilcox was the one who really was the mastermind behind everything. It blew up. It really blew up. And then in January or so of 2011, excuse me, Vox Media hired me full time, but I also got discovered locally. I was working on 106.7 The Fan, which was then WJFK, same station. It was like a guy talk station that turned into a sports talk station. They gave me a show on the weekends because one of the I had somehow finagled my way. The very first MMA event in Washington D.C., first pro MMA event, was May of 2007. And I did an interview with the guy who was the promoter, and he ended up telling me in the course of the interview they didn't have a color commentary guy. Now, this is extremely unprofessional, and I say this quite embarrassingly, but I just volunteered myself. I would never do that now, but whatever. I did it, so I can't say I didn't do it. I did it. And the guy who was the ring announcer is a guy who is still on the radio today. He does mornings with a few other guys called the Junkies. And they had me on because UFC is blowing up at this time and they don't have anybody to talk about it. And he found me. And then from that, I got a radio show. So I had a radio show. I had this kind of like other stuff, this other website. And then I went full time in 2011. And then I built from there. I had a television show on Spike TV for a while. And yeah, man, I've worn a few hats. I've been quite lucky to say it mildly.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it seems like the timing all worked out really well. When you were at Bloody Elbow, basically you're helping manage the site. Are you writing as well? Like, are you contributing and also kind of overseeing, like you said, you were looking at the traffic, like overseeing doing what and who's delivering articles? Was it primarily text-based at the time, I'm guessing, on Bloody Elbow?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, we're talking, again, roughly 2007 to 2011, somewhere in that time frame. And this is still when you're dealing with a lot of like reverse chronological sites, where the next one goes on top, kind of like your Twitter feed, so to speak. And it was almost exclusively text-based. But the advent of Twitter happened during that time, or I think a little bit later in that stretch. And you begin to see some of the beginnings of like Facebook streaming and Twitter being a little bit out there, and just little sort of nascent bubbles of a future to come. But it was certainly text-based. And yeah, my role was editor-in-chief. So I would do my own share of writing. That was how I kind of developed a bit of a name. And I would do my interviews on the radio, and then I would transcribe them and I would print them on the site. And that was good for both entities. So that actually ended up working really well. This is pre like everyone having a podcast too, So
yeah.
So video came after I went full time. And it was basically when I realized, I know you're probably going to get to this, but I basically just realized that video was very undiscovered. Like there were just a lot of people who were not doing it when I thought there could have been. The biggest one was I wanted to see if I was able to get a job at a big television outlet by just kind of doing this work. It actually, and the answer is yes, although those jobs don't really hardly exist that much, but I liked it. And I also kind of felt like, you know, you can make a living as a writer if you're exceedingly above your peers, right? Like you have to be really good. And because there's a lot of very talented writers. Like I'm not saying it's a dime a dozen, but they're not, you know, you might know some people in your circle that are actually like very capable writers. But to be the kind where you can really sustain yourself and do that at a high level, that is very difficult to do. And I thought, again, one more time, like I got in on MMA before everyone else got in on it. And the same with videos. Like I'm just going to get on this before everyone else does. First mover kind of advantage to a degree. And I kind of felt like it was a good opportunity. So once again, I ran with it. And
had you done any like when you were on the radio show and you were doing the color commentary, was that the first like actual like voice, like AV type of work that you had done? Because you do have a very good like radio voice. Had people told you that before?
People have told me that. People have told me that. I mean, I had done a little bit of like tinkering with stuff at home. I had done radio interviews. Certainly people had asked me to do things like, you know, hey, can you go 15 minutes and tell us about again, there was like all these sports radio stations that wanted to talk about it and they had no one to go to. It was at that time, they just didn't. It's like, imagine all of a sudden cricket blows up. You're like, who are the American cricket guys we can get? You know, and it's more of an international world now, and you could probably find somebody who was British or whatever who could do it. But you know what I mean? Like it was not so obvious, or rugby or something. It was not so obvious, and so I kind of served like that. And so I had a fair amount of, you know what? I don't know if I had the right experience, but I certainly had the right attitude. I had the right attitude, and I felt like once I got in, I was never going to let that opportunity go. Like, you know, how do you get a job in radio? I'm not sure. Like, I don't know if my path can really be followed. I just had to do what were the cards that were available to me to play. I just had to play those. And so once it was offered to me, I mean, I listened to radio all the time. Like I grew up in the era. So again, I graduated high school in 1998. Like this is at the time when major cities still had these enormous radio stations, and Howard was still the morning show for, you know, basically syndicated in all 50 states. Like radio still mattered, and I had listened to it endlessly my whole life, perhaps more than other people. And so once I got an opportunity, I'm not saying I was great at it. I probably would listen back to my old broadcast and cringe, but it was good enough to keep my job and keep escalating, and I have not looked back since.
And so there was actually a time, speaking of Howard Stern, where you had a show on Sirius Radio, correct? On SiriusXM. Yes. When did that happen along the timeline here? Because you're at SB Nation, and then how did you end up at Sirius? Because I imagine if you're somebody that admired Howard Stern, or at least like, you know, admired what he had done in radio, being able to get a show at SiriusXM, you know, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I had already done Spike TV, which now ended up being Paramount Network. I had already done that before I ever got to Sirius. Right around the same time. So I had turned full time again right around 2011, and at that time, I think I was still doing my radio show, but I ended up stopping that right around 2012, just because they ended up putting me like really late at. I mean, you got to remember, like a local radio station does not necessarily have a great incentive to do combat sports programming. That's probably not true in places like Las Vegas or something, but you know, Washington D.C., it's at the time the Redskins, the now Commanders, or the Nats, or the Caps, or something. That's where the audience is really going to be focused, and so they ended up putting me at like 8 p.m. at night on Sundays. And I'm not gonna say the juice wasn't worth the squeeze, but I thought maybe there's something else I could be doing more constructively with my time. But I want to be clear, I'm very grateful for that opportunity. It ran its course, as I guess the point I'm trying to make. It ran its course. And so I did SiriusXM. Here we go. They asked me to do an interview. Hey, can you be our preview guy for some UFC card that was coming up? I did it. And then 2 weeks later, I get a phone call, and they were like, we would like to expand and maybe hire you. And I was like, here we go. You know what I mean? And so I ended up doing a show with a couple other guys for a little while, maybe a couple of years or something. And then eventually they offered me my own show. And that was, I went full time with that 2016, something like that. I would have to go look at it quite more precisely, but it was the Luke Thomas Show, or something. Yeah, I think that's what it's called. Yeah, the Luke Thomas Show. And it was 5 days a week, 3 hours a day. I was doing 15 hours of radio a week, man. So that was tough at first, but it was great.
How much traveling
yeah, it's a lot.
were you doing going to and from the studio? Was it in DC?
Yes. So remember,
okay,
the original company was Sirius, and then there was another company, XM. They were actually originally separate, and then they merged. Well, the original XM studios are a mile from my house. So I actually could ride my bike to work. And in fact, I did. It actually worked out really well. Yeah.
Interesting. So, okay. So Sirius, and then let's talk about YouTube, right? Because I think for me, like I've been a fan of your YouTube channel for a long time, and obviously that's grown now. You have Morning Kombat as well on YouTube, but the Luke Thomas live chat is still going extremely strong, and I feel like the fan base has continued to grow, and you've built like a really great community there. What made you decide to start your own channel? And maybe you could talk a little about the early days of creating your own YouTube in parallel with all these other things you were doing.
It's funny, man. There's been so many decisions. I will just be candid with you. There's been so many decisions that I feel like some big, some small, some majorly consequential, some not. But for some reason, a lot of the ones you get wrong, you really remember. And I really feel like there's so many decisions. I always am amazed when people are like, I don't have any regrets. And I'm like, I don't know. That sounds like a psychopath. I don't know how you do that. I've tried my damnedest and made some real mistakes, you know? But the one I got right was this one. And what I mean by that is I kind of realized right around 2014, 15, 16, in that expanse of time, that there are going to be certain people within any organization. And don't get me wrong, I'm proud of a lot of the stuff I've done, and I've been lucky, and I've gotten a lot of opportunities. I don't mean to suggest that, woe was me. I don't mean it that way. But what I would say is I have kind of found that there are people who, in certain organizations, the organization tends to favor, and not necessarily with bad reason. You can understand it, or even if they don't favor one or the other, for some reason, you may not stand out at a time in which you think you should. And I kind of felt like I was in one of those scenarios where I was not treated, I was not doing poorly, but I did not feel like if I just let them decide what my upside was, I was going to remain unhappy. I wanted to decide what or at least I wanted the attempt to try to see what my upside was. The initial attempt at starting YouTube, I let it sit dormant for long periods of time too. And I opened up an account really early and then just didn't really do much with it. But once I realized that if I start providing coverage there, there's a gap. No one's really providing coverage in that way. But more importantly, I want to be seen the way that, it's going to sound tautological, but I want to be seen the way I want to be seen. I don't want to be seen the way that they think I should be seen, right? And so I wanted to do stuff where I could have an impact in an emerging sort of market, such that, YouTube, you can call it that. But the other one was I just wanted to do coverage that I controlled, that mattered to me, that centered me at the middle of it. I know this at the time, I will tell you, like around 2014 to 2015, it was real weird and uncomfortable for me to be like, I'm centering myself in this way, because that's really just that's not what people were doing back then. There were some people doing it, obviously, but a lot of the thought in institutional media was you put the brand first and you kind of like sublimate yourself to that brand. But like the reality is, dude, look at these brands today. You know what I mean? And I'm not suggesting that they don't have talented people there that haven't worked hard, but the 2010s were all about these new media companies that were going to change the world. They were going to change internet coverage. They were going to figure it out. And you just had to surf that wave. And I would say that a lot of those promises, not necessarily their institutional promises, but the promises about that emerging industry, they did not come true. They did not come true. I mean, media is in a troubled state because a lot of the problems that they were attempting to solve did not get solved. And it turned out that if you actually turn the camera to you, as uncomfortable as that might make you feel to a degree, and you actually make your face and your brand the thing that matters, that the thing that stands out, you actually will potentially develop an audience, and you actually will potentially be able to do this in a sustained way. And YouTube was the mechanism that helped so much of that take flight for me. I could not imagine where I am today. I don't even know if I don't know what my future would look like if YouTube didn't exist. I'll just put it that way.
You know, when I see you with your own channel and MK, it's like, I love the MK content, but when I see the Luke Thomas live chat and the community, you know, like continuing to grow, it's easy to look at it. It's like, okay, like monthly, quarterly, it's like, but in 5 years, like in another 5 years, if you look back 5 years from now where you were on YouTube and you look forward another 5 years, it's I think you just continue doing what you're doing, right? And
right.
As long as you're consistent, I mean, YouTube is probably not going anywhere for decades. It's going to be very difficult to for the cards to shift in a way where a company that's owned by Google, and 60% of the phones in the world come preloaded with YouTube. It's another great advantage nobody thinks about, is every single Android device comes with YouTube, right? So
right.
That's a big market share that's not going anywhere. You have Google AdSense supporting it. And so when I see people playing the long game on YouTube, part of the reason that we do this show is the next generation of people that are thinking about where to hedge their bets, right?
Right.
And so kudos to you for, being one of the early people in the space and sticking with it. I know we're coming up on time here, so I think I want to talk about just two other quick things. One is, I think Morning Kombat is kind of the intersection of, somewhat like television production. You guys have like a studio, you have a real show. Obviously with Showtime, you guys were doing 3 times a week. It was an incredible amount of output. You've shifted now, like we have the new DraftKings Network supported show. But I know that the MK fan base is just really excited that you and BC are back. So can you talk about Brian Campbell, working with him, and how MK has impacted your life and just professionally and personally, having another really creative, interesting outlet to do what you do?
Again, just one of those things where I'm just getting very lucky. So I had done like a bit of a roundtable show previously at one of my previous employers. It was called the MMA Beat. That was the show that we did. And we were trying to just sort of do, MMA media / journalist roundtable, and different media guys would come in. It was shot out of New York City because at the time that's where most of us were. Brian's from the Connecticut area. And so we had him on a few times. I had met him previously because while I cover MMA, I also cover boxing, and I met him at Mayweather versus Canelo back in the day. That's actually where we first met. So then we had him on. So I remember when someone asked me, "Hey, should we get Brian Campbell on the MMA Beat?" I was like, "Oh yeah, the guy from I'd known him from previously. I'd been friendly with him. I was like, let's get him on." And he was great. He was really great. And I'll never forget. I had developed an opportunity to work with Showtime. This is, of course, 2019-ish. And they wanted to do like a 2-person kind of show. And they were like, who do you have in mind? And I knew that at the time, Brian had a relationship with Showtime, and he was also in the area. They wanted to shoot it out of New York. And I was like, let's do Brian Campbell. Showtime was all about it because they already were good with him. They already been worked with him. And I think a lot of people didn't know what to think, but I had a strong feeling that between like kind of my seriousness and his goofiness, and him from boxing and me from MMA, but both of us kind of covering both, there was a lot of opportunity there. And sure enough, man, I can't tell if the pandemic hurt us or helped us. I think it mostly helped us because we were able to go do things when a lot of other people weren't. I think that did give us some advantages, but we were also just trying to have fun. We were trying to build. We purposely went into that show not so much thinking about the content, although yes, we did, but it was mostly about like, I told Brian this, and Brian was like, I think he had the exact same feeling. Like, we wanted to build a community. And again, going back to YouTube, there was never a doubt about where we were going to put that. We were going to put that on YouTube. We knew that was the best place for it. You got to remember something too about MMA audiences I didn't mention previously. They're digital native. Very quickly, I must tell you the story because it does set the table. I had gone full time at this point. So now I'm full time covering MMA, boxing too, but mostly MMA. And a fight had come to DC. It was Amir Khan versus Lamont Peterson. And I wanted to go to the opening press conference, which took place, I think it was at the W. So I went there, and because you get to interview Amir Khan and then Lamont Peterson. Lamont was from DC. And there was a scrum with Amir Khan. It was my first boxing press conference. And I will never forget, this is 100% true, I had never even seen this at an MMA press conference. It was time to do a scrum with Amir Khan, and all of the boxing reporters had tape recorders that they were putting in the face. I had literally never seen that. And I was like, whoa. But you have to remember something. That's not just true of the media class. That's true of the fan as well. Everything about them was a digital first audience all the time. So when it came time, many years later, when BC and I were trying to figure out where we're going to do this, where we're going to put it, what's the model, it was YouTube, YouTube, YouTube. Make no mistake about it. And I think that enabled us to do something like last year, February of 2023, Brian and I did a sold out show in London, England, for nothing but British or whoever could come to that fans. And of course it was vast majority were 99% British. How does that happen but for the power of YouTube? How does that happen? It doesn't, is the answer. And so it allowed us to go live. It allowed us. Oh, thank you. It allowed us to go live. It allowed us to, reach different audiences. It allowed us to all the things that we did with that show. And it was the individual chemistry, obviously, but it was also the kind of community we built from who we were trying to be as, entertainers and, media folk. And dude, that went so much better than I ever thought it could. Obviously, Showtime went away, and so there's been some challenges. We're now the DraftKings Network, and we're back to once a week. I don't think that will be the case forever. I think we'll probably expand again. But just to be able to be in this place, especially again in the current media climate, which is a tough one. I keep getting lucky, but I have to say you got to make good decisions too, and YouTube has been probably the very best one.
Yeah, definitely. And what do you see the future? The next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Do you have any personal goals or ambitions or projects that you're really excited about?
I mean, so I would say, let's say this: 20 years, I couldn't possibly tell you. I think it's I never
somewhere, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that or who knows? I don't know what to say, but 20 years, how old are you? Can I ask?
32.
32. I got married at 32. So for whatever that's worth, I will tell you this. The first 20 years of my life took forever. The second 20 went like that. And I have a feeling that the next 20 are going to do the exact same. And it just kind of creeps up on you, and it becomes harder and harder. Once you begin to lose track of things, it gets harder and harder to predict. So 20 years, I do not know. And I think anybody who says that they know what media
alive would be a victory.
I mean,
right?
Anybody who says they know what media is going to look like in 20 years, I would love to hear the theory. You know what I mean? 5 years, though, I think is a little bit more doable. I definitely feel like that's 5 and 10, certainly. And for me, it's steady as she goes. I think that investing in your own brand, and again, these were always very uncomfortable things for me to say, but investing in your own brand is absolutely critical. Listen, if there's opportunities at big mainstream institutions, and these could be good opportunities for you, I did that. I certainly would not want to dissuade someone from some of these opportunities that some of these places can provide. But what I will tell you is not everyone is going to see you the way you see yourself. And not every place is going to offer you the kinds of opportunities you want to, or to see yourself in those roles or in those kinds of places. You have to make those kinds of things happen. I think the next 5 years, honestly, I only see YouTube still growing. I don't know where it looks like at the end of the 5 years. That part's going to be kind of interesting. But what I would say is, I think that the power of the YouTube community will continue to kind of move forward. I actually do feel like it's everything else, not everything else, but it's many other things around it, where I'm expecting a media environment that is more fragmented, that is somewhat disintegrated, and it's going to be the ones that have decided that community is important, direct connection with the audience is important, using tools that enable you to deliver this in creative ways is important, and making sure that, as uncomfortable as you might feel, kind of, forcing yourself into these stories or otherwise making it about yourself, these are the kinds of things that you have to get over, because doing so are the pillars to sustainability. You're asking me what I want to do. There's obviously things I want to do. I want to do post-fight shows at a big desk after a big fight. Like that's kind of fun. I've only had a chance to do a couple of those. I want to get back on to doing, any number of things related to big fight weeks. Like I could go on and on for that. But to be perfectly honest, this is 100% the truth. I want to build something sustainable. I want to build something that I can, yes, you have to roll your sleeves up and do work, but that I can believe in. And if the bet is YouTube or what else is happening in the media world, it's YouTube 10 times out of 10. And that's kind of where I see myself building these communities. And last thing I'd say is I do a lot of technical kind of breakdown work, and I go after big boxing events and MMA events. I do both, kind of looking at what happened in these contexts and kind of illuminating it for the audience. These have been big, huge winners for me. It might have been of everything I've ever done on YouTube.
Even one the other day, the Pereira Hill breakdown.
Yeah,
right? Like that seemed to perform extremely well, and
it did 100K in almost 24 hours. Like it ballooned. Yeah, but like I've had ones do way more than that. Of everything I've ever done on YouTube, that might be the best thing. So my plan is, I was somewhat limited in all these ways about what I could spend my time doing, and now I've got more time to invest in myself. Last thing, I'm sorry, I'm meandering.
No, you're good.
I don't know much about Rick Rubin the person, but I've heard about this kind of way in which he describes what the importance. I'm not doing art, but it is a relevant teaching opportunity, which is, he says, you don't make art for the audience, you make it for yourself, and by doing that, you're giving yourself the very best chance for the audience to like it. That's the thing that they want. And again, I don't do art. That's not who I am. I don't mean to sound so pretentious, but what I can say is what YouTube enables, and I think why it's been so successful, certainly for me, but for everyone else, is that it enables creators or any of these people to do the kind of work that matters to them, that the subjects they care about, to reach the audiences in the ways that they want. And the result is quite clearly this enormous amounts of engagement and attention that are available to you. And I think my plan is, let's lean into that and see where that takes us.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. I think really what you're doing is you're creating value where there isn't, right? Like you're filling the gap in the market that you would want to see as a fan, or solving a problem that you have, right? And once you can get, like, because I even hear you talk about this, it's like your advice is yours and your own, right? Or not your advice, your take on what's happening, and have other people, striking coaches, grappling, whatever, can, they probably have their own perspective. But once you realize as the creator that your voice, that there's value behind your words and your take, nobody else is really doing it. And I think now it's gotten to the point where, even in your early ones, I know like in the past, like coaches have even wanted you to like break down fights for them and stuff, but you're the guy now for that, right? So like when something happens, whether it be boxing or MMA, not only are you filling the gap in the market, but it's like people are looking for the Luke Thomas breakdowns, right? So please serve us with more, because even if we're not, athletes ourselves, like the actual technical component of it, it's like what they do on the MLB network. Like their Harold Reynolds is out there with a clicker breaking down, how much the curveball drops, and like, yeah, right. Nobody watching that is throwing a curveball, but it's the X's and O's that matter, and no one else is doing that like you are. I think it's one of the most fantastic elements of your content that's out there. So
thanks.
It's really incredible. And to conclude, do you have any words to the Luke Thomas and MK supporters out there that have been with you up until this point on this journey?
I'm old enough. I mean, you can see the gray hairs. I've been doing this for a little bit longer than most. First of all, let me just say, no one ever owes you a click. No one ever owes you an email. No one ever owes you a thumbs up, a subscription, a super chat. They owe you nothing. And so for everyone who has ever offered these things, or even just watched a video, any part of this sort of attention economy, enormous thanks. And I would say, if I've learned anything over the course of this business, it's that you always have to have another act ready to go in your arsenal. You always have to have a pivot ready. You always have to be thinking about what you can do. And these things are all kind of similar, but the pivot's real, and there's differentiations in different parts of your life. And I wasn't sure after the end of Showtime what that pivot was going to really look like, but it has come into focus much more closely these days. I have a much clearer sense of it, and it's a lot of what I'm doing now, but a whole lot more of it on top. It is more MK, it is more breakdowns, it is more live programming. It's all the things that have been big winners, but I've got a finer sense of what works, and I've got a finer sense of how to be different this time around, and how my pivot to the next 5 years of my career should look. And I'm feeling, I got to tell you, there was a lot of uncertain times when Showtime went away, but I am feeling the best I felt about it in a long, long time. I'm ready. I'm ready to make the pivot, and I can't wait for them to join me.
I can't wait to see what's next and to continue to follow along. I can say from a fan's perspective, the energy in the MK ecosphere is at an all-time high, right? I feel not just from you and BC, but like the donks as well. I think people are really rejuvenated and excited. And so, you know, obviously looking back on it, I'm sure the times were rough, but maybe that little break and reset might end up being one of the best things to possibly happen. So really appreciate you giving your time, and interesting to hear about, you know, the background and how all of this has come to be, and can't wait to see what's to come as well. Thank you so much, Luke.
Thank you, buddy. I appreciate it.